Hey everybody, welcome to Defending the Biblical Roots of Christianity. And we've got an exciting guest on today. So a few months back, I was in San Antonio at the ETS conference, and I walked by the booth for Chosen People Ministries. And I was really excited to talk to them because I'm a fan of what they do. And this tall gentleman named Brian came out and introduced himself right away, and we kind of hit it off and ended up going out and having lunch together and just had this fabulous conversation. So I asked him if he wouldn't mind coming on our channel and talking a little bit about what we talked about that day and maybe even more. So we're going to bring on in a moment Brian Crawford. Let me give him a little proper introduction here. So Brian spent 9 years ministering to Orthodox Jewish people in Brooklyn, New York. So he's very much involved in the gospel being spread to the Jewish people. He has a doctorate of ministry in apologetics from the Talbot School of Theology. So he's a bright fella. He's currently the Director of Digital Evangelism for Chosen People Ministries. So what he's in charge of is sharing the good news of Yeshua, of Jesus, to the Jewish people. And so he directs the evangelistic site About Messiah and the apologetics site called Chosen People Answers, which are both great resources. So let me bring on, without further ado, my new friend, Brian. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks so much to have me with you.
Yes, no, this is great. I appreciate you coming on. Like I said, we had a riveting conversation over lunch, and so I wanted to share some of that. And I mentioned to you when we were talking before that there's sort of a disconnect sometimes in some of the comments I get from viewers and readers in just trying to understand what the difference is between Messianic Judaism and, let's call it, Torahism or Torah-keeping Christianity or Hebrew roots, and how we kind of sort that out. So we'll want to kind of jump in and tangle with that a little bit today. But first, I wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe share a little bit more about yourself. I read the highlight reel, but let us know, like, what are you doing, where you're located, what kind of work you're involved in day to day.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I've served with Chosen People Ministries for 14 years now. And my passion to share the gospel with the Jewish people really began when I went to Israel with my church when I was in college. And God just broke my heart for the salvation of the Jewish people. I got to actually talk with Israelis down on the ground, and I knew nothing about Jewish evangelism. And I came back to the States just with this passion to learn how I could better share the gospel with Jewish people. And that eventually led me to join Chosen People Ministries in 2010 and moved to Brooklyn in 2011. And I was in the middle of the Holy Land of Brooklyn, New York for 9 years, and did my master's degree in Messianic Jewish Studies, and in the middle of an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. So I understand the Jewish lifestyle, Jewish background, Jewish history, Jewish texts, and then continued on to get my doctorate, like you mentioned. And my real passion is in answering those difficult questions, the objections that many Jewish people have about believing in Jesus as the Messiah. And of course, the Torah comes up all the time. It's related to atonement. It's related to the gospel. It's related to what Paul said in the New Testament. It's related to what Moses said in the Torah. And so, of course, thinking about the Torah, writing about the Torah, thinking about how the Torah relates to believers in Yeshua, Jesus, all of that is part and parcel of sharing the gospel with Jewish people, especially those who are not so much secular, but are more religious in their background. And that's really my passion, and my training is focusing on reaching the religious, because quite honestly, they're some of the most unreached people on the planet. And so I'm trying to develop new ways of sharing the gospel with them.
That's awesome. That's great. So you are now with Chosen People Ministries. Maybe you could share a little bit about what they do and what your role is there.
Sure. So Chosen People Ministries has been all around for a long time. We were founded in 1894. So we're coming up on 130 years.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, long. We're kind of one of the granddaddies of the Messianic movement. And we're in 20 different countries. Our headquarters is in Manhattan. But we're all over the place. Wherever there's a major Jewish population center, we have staff members down on the ground. And our mission statement is really fourfold. We want to pray for, evangelize, disciple, and serve Jewish people and help fellow believers do the same. So we really are focused on ministering to the Jewish people first. Just like the Apostle Paul said in Romans 1:16, the gospel is the power of God for the salvation of all who believe, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. So we keep that priority first in our ministry. That doesn't mean that we don't minister to Gentiles. And of course, today,
Right.
when we're talking about Torahism and whatnot, we're going to be talking about a lot of Gentiles who are followers of Yeshua, Jesus, but they also think that they need to keep the Torah. And so that's not the focus of Chosen People Ministries by any stretch, but it is a adjacent issue that is related to many issues in Jewish evangelism. And more specifically, my role, I am the Director of Digital Evangelism, which means that I build websites for Jewish evangelism and apologetics. I run our apologetics department, which I've been building up over the last 9 or so years. And I write a lot of articles and write papers and do a lot of teaching and preaching and trying to help both Jew and Gentile have a more rational basis for their following of Jesus of Nazareth.
That's awesome. Okay, that's great. Yeah, and I know you and I have some common friends with Jonathan and Eric of Two Messianic Jews.
Yes.
Which, for those of you that don't know that are watching this, there's a YouTube channel called Two Messianic Jews, and those guys are great. And so that was sort of some commonality that we had when we sat down and had lunch together. And you're right. There's, what you're doing with Chosen People is very focused, and it's not kind of the focus of this channel of the defending of the biblical roots of Christianity from a Torah-observant sort of theology. But there's lots of overlap, and there's lots of, like you said, the Torah. That's the heartbeat of Judaism. It's also the foundation of Christianity. So, understanding what the Torah is and what it means to Christians today, that's something that you and I have both pursued a lot.
Sure, it's huge.
Before we get into it, so for those of you watching, Brian had shared with me some of the work he's doing, a fabulous paper that he's working on. It's not been published yet, but I want to get into it a little bit. It's called Are Gentiles Obligated to Keep the Torah? And so we'll get into that in a minute. But before we do, I kind of want to tease apart this idea of Messianic Judaism and Hebrew roots, or Torah-observant Christianity, or Torahism, which is a broad brushstroke that talks about a lot of different groups. But essentially, the description or the connection point between those folks would be they are followers of Jesus, and in my experience, 100% of them are Gentile, but they're followers of Jesus who believe that Christians today are required to keep the Old Covenant law, the law of Moses, and that if we don't do that, we're in sin. Now, as opposed to that, there's something called Messianic Judaism, and I don't know what your definitions are, but could you kind of speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Messianic Judaism. Well, if you really want to be specific, it began circa 32 or so AD when a bunch of Jews believed in the Jewish Messiah and then started preaching in Jerusalem that the Jewish Messiah had come. And this thing called Christianity, that we now call Christianity, it began as a Jewish movement. So Messianic Judaism today is an attempt to recover the Jewishness of our faith for Jews who believe in Jesus. Now, Messianic Judaism as a title, it's a newer title, and it is a newer movement. There have always been Jewish believers in the church for the last 2,000 years, but for the most part, in most centuries, they were ostracized and not really accepted for being Jews as Jews. They were oftentimes required to leave their communities, leave their traditions behind, and basically assimilate into the larger Gentile church, which really didn't have any place for Jewish traditions, for the festivals, for those things. So
Sure.
for many centuries, Jews didn't really have a place to live out their faith in Yeshua like the first century apostles did. That started to change around the early 1800s when you had the ghettos opened up by Napoleon and others. Jews started entering the wider society, and missions work began among the Jewish people in ways that had never been done before. And the Anglicans were really at the forefront of this. And so something called Hebrew Christianity started to grow up in the early 1800s. And tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Jewish people came to believe in Jesus as the Messiah in the 19th century. And we have lost a lot of their history and their institutions and their influence because many of their descendants, tragically, were murdered in the Holocaust. But starting just after World War II, you started to have some of these Jewish believers in Jesus who survived, starting to realize that they needed to have a place where they could worship Yeshua with Jewish traditions, and that the wider Gentile churches weren't really a good place for them to do those kinds of things, like celebrating the festivals, how Yeshua is the fulfillment of them, and perhaps meeting on Saturday, on Shabbat, for their worship services and whatnot. And so starting in around the 1970s, some of these Hebrew Christians started calling themselves Messianic Jews. And they started forming Messianic congregations that met on Shabbat and started worshiping Yeshua in a more Jewish way, still saying that they are a part of the wider global church, but they are the Jewish expression of the church, and still saying that they are united with the wider Gentile church. And so Messianic Jews are Jews who believe in Jesus, yet retain a sense of their Jewish background, Jewish traditions, in their expression of their worship of Jesus. Now, where it gets a little confusing sometimes is that many Messianic congregations also have Gentiles in attendance.
Right.
And so that's where this question of, well, what's their identity? Are they Christians? Are they Messianic Gentiles? Do they need to convert to Messianic Judaism? You get all kinds of these different options. Now, I myself, I am very proud to say that I am just a Christian. I am an evangelical Christian who is also part of the Messianic movement, maybe a sojourner, if you will. I am not Jewish. I'm not a spiritual Jew. I haven't been made into some kind of spiritual Jew because of my faith in Jesus. No, I'm a Gentile who is a follower of Jesus, who is a part of the Messianic movement. And I work with many Messianic Jews who are ethnically Jewish who believe in Jesus as the Messiah.
Well, that's a great explanation. Yeah. And I think therein, you just touched on, I think, where there's a little bit of confusion, because the word Jew can mean someone who practices Judaism versus someone who's ethnically or ancestrally Jewish, biologically, so to speak. And so ethnic Jews, folks who come up and that's their ancestry, who have come to faith in Jesus, are calling them, not all, but refer to themselves as Messianic Jews. I know there's some issue with some of them. I've heard in talking with them, they just prefer not to use the word Christian, which I get. I mean, it's a loaded term these days. But in general, and tell me if you agree with this, what I've discovered in my research and talking with a lot of folks about this is that if we talk about general, let's call it mainstream Christianity, just not talking about denominational beliefs, but general Christianity, the Messianic Judaism holds to the same theology. Would you agree with that?
Sure. You can go to the websites of some of the major Messianic Jewish organizations, like the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, the MJAA, that's a major denomination. The UMJC, the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, those are the two major Messianic Jewish denominations. You can read their statements of faith, and they are incredibly orthodox and evangelical. And these denominations were birthed out of Protestant evangelicalism. And then you can go to my organization, Chosen People Ministries. You can go to Jews for Jesus. You can read our statements of faith, And they are orthodox. They are historically grounded, and they are orthodox.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And by the way, if you're watching this, I'll put links to all those resources below. Yeah, so that was a thing that I think surprises a lot of people, because they assume or think that there's some theological difference, especially around who is Jesus and how are we saved through faith in him and those sorts of things. And they're all very orthodox with the lowercase o, orthodox Christian beliefs, which is amazing. And so what's really cool for me, like when I went to the Messiah conference, it's like this, there was nothing theologically foreign or scary that I heard, but on top of it was this beautiful cultural layer of things I read about in the Bible. You know what I mean? You put it well, recovering the Jewish roots of the Christian faith. But they're doing so without throwing out the true, Jesus-based evangelical Christianity, right? The Christ-centered and all that. And I think that's beautiful. And so I think there's a sense that I know personally I've learned so much from my Messianic Jewish friends and some of the rabbis I spoke with. And there's this kind of a different perspective, and it's really quite exciting. And I always think about this, and this is my next question for you, but I always think about, Romans 9 through 11, Paul's talking about what's going on with the Jews, and he talks about the mystery of how Israel will be saved, right? And the remnant will be grafted in. What are your thoughts in terms of, or maybe I should ask, well, yeah, your thoughts too, but, mainstream Messianic Judaism, do they see themselves as sort of the natural branches and they're being grafted back in when they come to faith in Jesus, or how do they view that?
Well, there's different interpretations as to what the tree in that analogy or that metaphor actually is.
Sure.
But I think everybody agrees, including in the Messianic movement, that Jewish people who come to faith in Jesus as the Messiah are those natural branches that are grafted back in.
Yeah.
And so they see themselves as being a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, of God's promises to his people, that there will always be a remnant in every single generation. That's basically what Paul's principle is in the beginning of Romans 11, that he basically points back to Elijah and says, well, just as in Elijah's day, there was a remnant chosen by grace, so too here in 55 AD, there's a remnant chosen by grace. And that seems to be a universal principle. So that means that so too today in 2024, there's a remnant chosen by grace.
Right.
And the Messianic Jewish movement is that remnant.
Yes, that's beautiful. I love that. I didn't get a chance to say this, but when I was in my debate with Rabbi Singer a while back, and he was talking about, no Jews, no, Jesus isn't for the Jews. I forgot how he put it. And I remember thinking, maybe the Messianic Jews are the remnant today. Those who are not shying away from their Jewishness, but they're also embracing their own Messiah. And that's an amazing thought to me, because whenever you read things that are still going on today that the Bible's explaining, I mean, it feels like the word comes to life, Paul talks about those remnants of remnants of Israel, and here we see them, and I met and talked with them. I mean, that's so cool. Yeah. So let me just read this, Romans 11:24. Paul's saying this is the grafting analogy, and Paul's saying this to the Gentiles. After all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, so he's talking about the natural olive tree, whatever that represents. I think it represents sort of the ancestry from Abraham. How much more readily will these, the natural branches, the ethnically Jewish believers, be grafted into their own olive tree? And I mean, it's a statement of immense hope and excitement in the way Paul words it. I love that.
Yes, and we are seeing them come to faith in ways that we haven't seen in numbers since the first century. I mean, that's what's so exciting in Jewish ministry, is that there was just a trickle here and there over the centuries. 19th century, like I mentioned before, was huge. But today, I mean, Messianic Jewish believers are in all over the world, and they're still small in numbers. It's still a remnant. It will always be a remnant, I believe, until our Messiah returns. But they are not as unknown as they were before.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. And like I said, I think there's so much for us to learn. There's so much, like when I attended a Messianic Jewish Passover Seder, and they talked about where Jesus is found in this. To me, it's so much. It blessed me, but it deepened my faith and my understanding. And then now you read through the Last Supper and you start catching these details. I think that's beautiful and amazing. And so I encourage my readers to embrace that. And what happens, at least what I've seen, is that Gentiles get into this thing. I forgot how Michael Brown, when he was on a while back, he put it great. They have this fascination, and then I forget his phrase, but it's
yeah,
fabulous.
I've heard it too.
Yeah. But the idea is it starts as a good thing.
Yes.
It starts as a beautiful thing. And then people...
It morphs. Yeah.
It morphs. Gentiles start taking it on, and I guess just doing what humans do, right? And humanizing. And so they start to become confused and start to become combative, even in some cases. And in my opinion, and this is where most of my work's been done for the last 5 years, they start to be what I call legislation. I've added a fifth step to Michael Brown's 4 steps. I forget what they are, but legislation, meaning they think everybody's required to keep these things. So what is the Messianic Jew, and maybe there's a range here, but what is the Messianic Jewish belief about some of those Torah commands like Shabbat and kosher food and the Torah feasts? Do they view themselves as sort of legally bound, or what's their relationship to the Torah?
That's a good question. So as with many theological questions, there are different positions on that in the Messianic movement.
Sure.
And I highly recommend a book by Richard Harvey called Mapping Messianic Jewish Theology.
By the way, I bought that on your recommendation. I haven't read it yet.
Excellent. He really names names and goes through the different camps within the Messianic Jewish movement. It's about 15 years old now, but it's still very relevant of the different positions. So almost every single Messianic Jewish leader is going to say that keeping the Torah is not required for justification. That is for righteousness or for salvation before God. And that is one of the key touch points of Paul and of the Protestant Reformation, that you are not saved by your works. You are not saved by your attempts to be righteous on your own account.
Right.
You are saved by the righteousness of Messiah. And so, but there are still other positions within the Messianic movement that fall short of needing it for justification, for righteousness. There are some who would say that you ought to keep these things as a matter of obedience for sanctification, for your own growth in holiness. There are others who say that we should keep them because we're Jews, and that's just what Jews do. So it's more of a sociological kind of thing on a horizontal level rather than a vertical level,
Sure.
as if it's before God. And then there are others who say that you're permitted to keep the commandments in the Torah, but not required to. And so you've got a whole spectrum of belief on these issues in the Messianic community. But if you are in the Messianic Jewish sphere, you're not just a Jewish believer who's worshiping perhaps at the local Baptist church. Most Messianic Jews who are in the Messianic Jewish sphere tend to see that there is a real value, whatever that value is, but there is a real value in keeping the festivals, in worshiping on Shabbat, in keeping Jewish tradition. Now, whether that is something that God requires of them, there's different positions,
Sure.
but they don't believe that it is required for righteousness before God.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And that's obviously, from my perspective, that's very biblical. And I love the fact that the Apostle Paul did nothing to hide or run from his own Jewishness. He doubled down on it. And so I really feel like a big takeaway from Paul's writings is that, look, you can believe in Jesus. You don't have to leave any of your Jewishness behind. But at the same time, Paul, as the apostle to the Gentiles, also taught that, hey, you guys are also welcome in, and you don't have to worship the same way, right? We're worshiping the same God. We're under the same sort of set of house rules, family rules. But the way we express that can be so much different. And I love that. I feel like this is God creating a kingdom of unity, but not uniformity. And if you look at the world, that's what the world is like. Why didn't he make all the colors of the flowers the same? Or, you know what I mean? So this is this beautiful image of God in the body of Christ. As it says in Revelation 7, people from every tribe and nation and tongue, including all 12 tribes of Israel, which are also listed in that chapter. So this is a beautiful big family reunion. And that's kind of what I felt like when I was at the Messianic Jewish conference. And I know everybody there wasn't necessarily ethnically Jewish, but as opposed to some of the sort of mainstream, really big Christian conferences I've been to, that one in particular felt like some friends invited me to their family reunion, and I was hanging out with all their uncles and aunts, and there was just a really cool familial community feeling there.
Love it.
So that brings up, though, the interesting question, and I kind of want to now dovetail or turn into some of the work you've done that you shared with me that I thought was brilliant. So this idea of, are Gentiles obligated to keep the Torah? So now we have in the kingdom of God Jews and Gentiles that make up the body of Christ, right? Romans 3, Paul says, is God the God of the Jews only? No, of Gentiles also. So now we kind of, there's a lot of confusion as we kind of look at, okay, the Jewish relationship to the Torah, which you've kind of just outlined. What's the Gentile relationship to the Torah for believers? I should say Gentile believers.
Yeah, great question. So the question of the relationship of the law of Moses, the Pentateuch or the Torah, however you want to call it, to Gentile Christians is one of the big questions of theology for the last 2,000 years. And the way that I put it is important. The relationship of the law to Gentile Christians. Now, oftentimes in church history, this has not been parsed out in that way. It's just been for Christians in general. But like you rightly just said, there are Jews in the church and there are Gentiles in the church. And perhaps there are different covenantal backgrounds to Jews and Gentiles in the church that may change the answer based on if you are a Jew from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob versus a Gentile who had pagan forefathers who didn't stand at the foot of Mount Sinai and didn't take on the covenant that was given to Israel. So, you've got law and grace, and you've got Calvin's tripartite division of the law with only the moral law continuing. You've got all these different opinions, and it can be really hard to try to figure out which way is up or down.
Right.
And I think that a lot of the people in the one law movement, or in also called the Hebrew roots movement, they tend to they found a niche where many Christians are just not familiar with these issues. They've been confused their whole life about the relationship of the Old Testament to the New Testament, and so in come the one law position, which basically says that the church has been wrong on this for centuries, for millennia. And
let me pause you right there, if you don't mind. I want to clarify for the viewers, when you say one law, what does that refer to, or why is that moniker chosen?
This is often chosen by people in this movement to refer to how there is one set of commandments, one law, one Torah that is given to all people when you believe in Jesus.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
So it is a quotation from Numbers, where Moses says there shall be one law for you and also for the sojourner in your midst. So there's this idea that even the Gentile sojourner ought to follow or be subject to the same law as the ethnic Israelite. But that is then applied today to Gentile Christians who have been brought into the kingdom of God through the new covenant. But now that also means that now they're obligated to keep the same law as Israel, as the Jewish people. So with the new covenant, kind of in the back door, comes the old covenant. And because they're seen as really the same thing. Yeah.
That goes kind of back to that grafted in thing I mentioned. I've heard so many times from Hebrew roots folks or Torahism, hey, we've been grafted into Israel, so now we live by Israel's laws. It's the same concept that you're talking about as one law.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's no distinctions.
Right.
It's the same for Jew and Gentile. It is 100% the same, and there's a certain beauty to that. Kind of the egalitarian nature of it, that we're all equals at the foot of the cross, and so all of us do the same things. And so I get it from a certain perspective, but
Sure.
not from a biblical perspective.
So biblically speaking, I'm sorry I knocked you off your trajectory. From a biblical perspective, Gentiles, let's say Gentiles today, what's their relationship to the Torah?
Yeah. So
Especially the legal commands therein.
yeah, I am of the opinion that the Torah ought to be read as a covenant that was given to a particular people, and that Gentiles were not signatories, they were not partners in that covenant. They didn't enter into that covenant at Sinai, and that the new covenant does not entail this backdoor ratification of the Sinai covenant for Gentiles. So I believe that there are, kind of like what the Apostle Paul said in Romans, that there are Jews who have the law and there are Gentiles who don't. They may have parts of the law inscribed on their hearts kind of unconsciously. They don't even know that they're keeping the Torah by not murdering people and by not stealing and that kind of stuff. But they are not brought into the obligations of the Sinai covenant through their faith in Yeshua, that they are obligated to the law of Christ or the law of Messiah, which is basically the commandments and the teachings of Jesus and the apostles.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah, we're largely on the same page there. And I think there's something beautiful and helpful. I get a little bit scared to say this because of some of my viewers will take this and run with it, but there's something beautiful and helpful in this pursuit of the Jewish roots of the Christian faith, insofar as we keep it biblical. And you've done a nice job of outlining when we get past maybe the biblical boundaries of what that means, but to even understand, because I have to say I'm empathetic to this idea that, hey, the Old Testament isn't taught as much as it should be in general. It's a broad brushstroke, but in general, in the modern Western church, the Old Testament isn't really taught. The Torah isn't taught, I think, to the degree it should be. And so there is something good about that, right? But the other side of that, it's a double-edged sword, because the other side of that, now you have people, again, 100% Gentiles. I keep saying that. If someone wants to prove me wrong, let me know. But who believe that, who are taking on a mantle of obligation that was given to ancient Israel within the context of that covenant, and they're taking it on today. And so when you get Gentiles that kind of, I don't know what I want to say, muddy the waters on this issue, and you've got other Christians who aren't broadly taught much about the historical Torah roots of the faith, a lot of folks don't have a defense. They don't understand. I sense that's wrong, but I don't understand why, and I can't explain it. And so they get confused and all that. And so what I'm curious about is, if you're familiar with, in the broader Messianic Jewish movement, do they include Gentiles? And do Gentiles in that movement, maybe that attend Shabbat at the local Messianic synagogue, do they cause trouble, or how is that affected?
The Messianic congregations that I have been a part of and have preached in and been close with, Jew and Gentile are worshiping together in Messiah as equals, even though they acknowledge that Gentiles are under no obligation to do so. That it is a voluntary hitching together with their fellow Jewish believers in Jesus, but it is not something that is obligatory for them. Many Gentiles, and this is one of the problems in the Messianic movement, actually, many Gentiles who attend Messianic synagogues also attend Gentile churches on Sunday.
Oh, okay.
And part of the problem in that is that it's hard to build a Messianic congregation if many of your Gentile participants are splitting their loyalties between two congregations, which Bible study they're going to go to, where are they going to give their giving, their tithing. And so many of these Gentile believers in Jesus, they don't see anything wrong with worshiping at the Baptist church or the Assemblies of God church or the Presbyterian church down the street. It's not a moral issue. It's not an obligation for them
Right.
to worship at a Messianic congregation. It is a voluntary choice because they find value in worshiping Yeshua in a more Jewish way.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So when it comes to this idea of Gentiles being obligated to keep the Torah, one thing we'll often hear is what you referred to, the whole reason they're called one law. They believe that, there was a mixed multitude at Mount Sinai. And it does say in Exodus 12 that there was a mixed multitude that left Egypt with Israel. And it's not at all unreasonable to presume that same group of we'll say Gentiles mixed in, were also traveling with Israel all the way up to Mount Sinai, and maybe they were there, maybe they heard the voice of the Lord given the 10 Commandments. But how do you respond to that idea that because there was a mixed multitude there, they also are just as much partakers in that same covenant?
Yeah, so the issue of sojourners, mixed multitude, conversion to Judaism, or being included into the Jewish fold, it is present in the Hebrew Scriptures, but it's also very murky. The issue of conversion is typically, especially in Orthodox Judaism today, you look at Ruth the Moabitess, who, according to the Torah, no Moabitess should be allowed into the presence of the Lord. And that creates problems for her grandson, David, who was a descendant of a Moabite. And so then by extrapolating backwards, then maybe God sees Ruth, because of her acceptance of the God of Israel, no longer as a Moabitess, but as a convert, an Israelite by faith. And so she's kind of seen as a paradigm. But there are others in the Hebrew Scriptures who just live around Israel, maybe in Israel's midst, maybe they're doing work, but it doesn't actually say that they necessarily share the same faith, but they're called sojourners, and they are also obligated to participate in certain national festivals and whatnot. And so the question of what is the ethnic status, what is the religious status of these sojourners, you get a lot of academics trying to figure this out, especially because when you get to the intertestamental period and Second Temple Judaism, the category of sojourner kind of disappears.
Yeah.
And now we see proselytes. And then you get these others who are not converting to Judaism. They're not getting circumcised. They're still calling themselves Gentiles, and yet they've attached themselves to Israel. That would be like Cornelius in the book of Acts.
Right.
So it gets more complicated, and really it is not as simple as, hey, if you're a sojourner, you're treated as a Jew. It's not that simple. And in my work, I've found some places where we really do see that there was a distinction between the sojourners in the Hebrew Scriptures and native-born Israelites. And a couple places I'll point you to. In Leviticus 25, an Israelite could purchase a sojourner for permanent servitude as human property, but native-born Israelites could not be purchased in that way. So there was a distinction there. In Second Chronicles, we learn that David gave a census of all the people living in Israel, and he separated out the native-born Israelites from the sojourners. And then, so that's fine. You can have different categories in your census. But here's the thing. Then Solomon, to build his temple, he conscripts every single sojourner to basically do forced labor for the temple.
Yeah.
Now he doesn't conscript Jews in that way. They're exempt from that. But
Right.
he conscripts all the sojourners. So we see here that sojourners are not exactly treated in the same way as native-born Israelites. And then, of course, we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, and they are very against Jews marrying non-Jews, whether they're sojourners or not.
Right.
There's a very clear distinction there, and this is biblical. This isn't just coming up out of nowhere. Sometimes people say in the book of Acts that Peter said, "Oh, I'm not allowed to eat with Gentiles, and I'm not allowed to even be in their presence," and that wasn't really a biblical thing. Well, you get Ezra and Nehemiah; they're making it clear that Jews really do need to keep themselves separate for self-preservation, and that didn't include, marrying sojourners, converting sojourners, evangelizing sojourners, and bringing them into the Israelite fold.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't see any evangelism in Judaism. They're not trying to go out and convince people.
Not today, but they used to. They used to. And unfortunately, it was really the Christian kings and emperors of the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, not 3rd, that's too early, 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, who basically forced Jews to stop proselytizing. But before the rise of Constantine and other Christian kings and whatnot, Jews were actually known for proselytizing. It's just they don't anymore because basically Christians forced them to stop.
Okay. I didn't realize that. That's interesting.
Well, you see Jesus saying, you Pharisees, you send your messengers all over the world but then he says, and you make them twice the son of hell as you
Right.
are. So
Yeah.
he makes a negative comment, but he's making this assertion that you Pharisees, you're involved in missionary work. And there's a lot of other evidence of Jewish missionary work.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so you've got in the early, the Gospels in the early Christian era. I don't even know if you can call it that. Let's call it pre-resurrection. There is still a very clear distinction trying to be made. Jesus says, you're only going to the lost sheep of Israel. I've only come for the lost sheep of Israel. Tells the disciples to only go to, stay away from the Gentile towns. So there's still that clear distinction. And what's interesting is after the resurrection, then Jesus says, you will be my witnesses in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And he says, go and make disciples of all nations. So there's this interesting thing about how the resurrection brought about a seismic shift in all of that. And so what's interesting, and I think this is going to be my next question because it always comes up, people talk about, so you've got the new covenant, first prophesied by Jeremiah 31, right? I will make a new covenant, not like the old one, because you broke the old one, and I was your husband, and you were unfaithful, and all that. And it says, I will make it with the house of Judah and the house of Israel. And then when we get to the New Testament, and Hebrews 8 repeats that same thing again, what a lot of times Hebrew roots folks will point to, Gentile believers will point to, is that new covenant is only for Israel and Judah. And so as a Gentile, I have to stop being a Gentile and I must be grafted in or become part of the citizenship of Israel in order to be part of the new covenant. How do you respond to something like that?
Well, I don't see any evidence of that logic or that implication in the New Testament. I see that Jews continued circumcising their children in the New Testament, like Paul circumcised Timothy because he had a Jewish mother. And I see the same Jewish church outlawing circumcision for Gentiles. Now, why was there a different practice between the two segments of the church? If there's one law for all and Gentiles practice the same thing, then why aren't Gentiles circumcising their sons? That is one of just many problems.
Okay, so we just had some quick technical difficulties there, but let's actually move the conversation a little bit more towards the work that you do with Chosen People Ministries. So I'm curious how Jews, religious Jews, respond, or what if they have a thought about Messianic Jews? Are they viewed as traitors, or they just consider them Christians, or what's the view there?
Yeah, by and large, most Jewish people are confused by Messianic Jews. They just don't get it. They have two categories in their head. They have Judaism and Christianity, and they're very different conceptions in their head. And it seems
Sure.
like these Messianic Jews are doing something really weird by trying to mix these categories, and they tend to see them as Christians who are just make believing that they're still Jews. But of course, that biblically, that's not the case. I mean, was Peter or John playing make believe as Jewish in the first
Right.
century in believing Jesus as the Messiah? So a lot of these preconceived notions in the Jewish world are mostly because they have a conception of Christianity in their head that is just totally Gentile. And they just don't know about the Jewish roots of our faith. They don't know what happened in the first century. And so a lot of it is born out of really an ignorance of where Christianity comes from, which is a Jewish a Jewish school of thought, a Jewish philosophy, a Jewish religion.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, a lot of the Messianic Jews that I spoke with, they talked about when they first came to believe in Jesus and how blown away they were when they first read Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
And look at this genealogy. They're talking they didn't realize how Jewish the New Testament was.
For sure.
So what is kind of swinging over even more to the apologetic work you do? Because as an apologist, this is really interesting to me. As you know, I've done a little bit of debating in the Jewish world, even though lots of my stuff is Hebrew roots. But there's this weird shift I had to make. So when you're talking with someone that's a Torah-observant Christian, they believe in Jesus as the Messiah and they accept the New Testament. When you're talking to a Jewish person who's either secular or religiously Jewish, they reject both Jesus and the New Testament. So what do you hear, or what's the general conception for, let's say, religious Jews of who Jesus, the historical person, actually was? Was he a myth? Was he a fraud? What do they think?
So the historic religious Jewish position is that Jesus really existed. He was a Jewish man who grew up in Judea. They don't deny his Jewish background, but they view him as a false prophet who attempted to be a prophet but failed. And the reason why he failed is because basically he claimed to be God in the flesh, and that is not allowed, that is something that disqualifies whatever he teaches. Some more sophisticated Orthodox Jewish people may say, hey, Jesus kept the law, he kept the Torah, and so he was okay in that regard, but all of his followers stopped keeping the law. Therefore, that invalidates his messianic credentials, because to be the Messiah requires that all of your followers keep the law of Moses. And so
The Deuteronomy 13 test of a false prophet?
there's a Deuteronomy 13 test, but if you really read Deuteronomy 13 closely, it doesn't say that the false prophet will have any kind of relationship to keeping or not keeping the law in general. It will say, it says that he will do false signs and wonders because he will entice people to idolatry. And
Yeah.
so that is the real the real test, is whether Jesus encouraged following false gods or a false god, and that it doesn't really necessarily have to do with whether he or his disciples followed the Torah. Now, of course, I believe that Jesus kept the entire Torah, that it was possible for him to keep the entire Torah, because he lived when there was a temple, there was a priesthood, there was all of that. But it is objectively impossible to keep the Torah today. And anybody who says that they are Torah observant or keeping the Torah, they are playing rhetoric games, because they simply cannot keep the entire Torah. Now, whether you're
Right.
Gentile or Orthodox Jewish, both sides make the claim that they are Torah observant, and for the same reason, both of them are just playing rhetoric games.
Yeah, I agree with you. But let me play devil's advocate for a moment and say, here's the response that I'll often hear: that God gave Israel some stuff to do while the temple wasn't available. And so he told them what they could do when there wasn't a temple to go worship, and that didn't break the law. So why should we be any different today when there's no temple?
Yeah, so the question of what you're supposed to do for atonement when there's no atonement is a big question. When there's no temple, how do you receive atonement? And in this frame of reference, many Torah pursuant Hebrew roots one law Christians follow the same line as Orthodox Judaism, which basically says if it is impossible for you to keep the commandment, God does not require you to keep the commandment. And so
Right.
just because Daniel couldn't do sacrifices, that didn't mean that he had to do the sacrifices. God, in effect, kind of lets him off the hook from the obligation of doing all of those commandments. And so in Orthodox Judaism, they have said, well, you don't have to do all those sacrificial commandments when there's no temple. Now, that's a logical deduction that is never actually said in Scripture. And then they say that you can replace the need for that atonement by loving God, serving others, doing the other Torah commandments that you can do. They basically tried to replace the sacrificial system of the temple with other systems. And
Right.
and so the same logic happens in Hebrew roots movement, where they
Oh yeah,
say
for sure.
that, well, I know it says that you have to go to the priest when you have a skin rash, but there's no priest today, so we don't have to do that.
Yeah, not very biblical.
No, and especially if you're saying that we keep the Torah.
Right.
Well,
Right.
Leviticus 4 says if you sin, you must go take an animal to the priest and have it be sacrificed on your account. Now, I
Right.
fall under the stipulation of that. I have sinned. And everybody listening to this has sinned. So Leviticus chapter 4 gives us the procedure of what you're supposed to do. Go get an animal, take it to the priest. But nobody does that today. That means that according to Leviticus chapter 4, we are breaking the Torah every single time we sin.
Right.
And
And
I don't
so,
believe God lets
yeah,
us off the hook for that if the Sinai covenant is 100% in operation today.
yeah, I agree. And it reminds me so much, if you read about the early centuries after the destruction of the temple and the dispersion of the priesthood and all that's gone, now rabbinic Judaism starts trying to say, how do we keep Israel as a nation without a temple or a priest? And you start to get these sort of, it just reminds me of the same thing that happened in the intertestamental period, where they were adding all these man-made things on top of what the actual Torah says. And so this idea of being able to, we do what we can, and that's enough, is not how God spelled it out.
Right. It's not.
And you're right; that's exactly picked up by Torah-observant. I have to do air quotes, Torah-observant Christians,
Right.
and that's a big problem. And so I wanted to. Do we have time? Yeah, we do. You laid out a really cool case for us, everyone at the table that day, talking about the destruction of the second temple. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Talking about why it was destroyed.
Mhm.
Yeah, can you kind of walk us through
Sure.
the promises and all that stuff that you're talking about? Because I thought that was fascinating.
Right. So a lot of my apologetics work in the area that we've been talking about has been in diving into what I call the impossible mitzvot, the commandments that are in Scripture, but nobody can do today, no matter how faithful you are, no matter how much you love the God of Israel, you simply cannot do these things. So, like, for instance, it says in Deuteronomy chapter 16 that 3 times a year your males shall appear before the Lord in the place that he shall choose, which is Jerusalem. And so 3 of the main festivals, they're Aliyah festivals, where you're supposed to go up to Jerusalem. And it says you are not supposed to arrive empty-handed. And it also says you're not supposed to celebrate it anywhere else. So basically what that means is that if you think that you are Torah observant in keeping Passover in California or keeping Passover in London, then you're actually breaking the Torah, because you're only supposed to celebrate that in Jerusalem. But it's impossible to celebrate it in Jerusalem according to the way that it's been laid out in the Torah. It's impossible. There's no temple, there's no priesthood, there's no way to do sacrifices. So what are you supposed to do with that? And so my work focuses on how over 50% of the traditional 613 commandments in Rabbinic Judaism are objectively impossible to do today. Over half of the Torah. Now, I believe that there are more than 613 commandments. That's just a traditional number.
Right.
You can go to Leviticus chapter 16, and they don't have any commandments for what the high priest is supposed to do on Yom Kippur. But let's just say 613 commandments. Well, what are you supposed to do when over half of them are impossible to do today? And the argument that is oftentimes given, like I mentioned before, is, well, if it's impossible to do them, then God does not obligate us to do so. And my work in this area has been really to focus in on that moral theory, which moral philosophers talk about it as the principle.
We had some technical difficulties. Brian's got a new camera set up. So we were talking about the moral theory.
Right. So moral philosophers talk about this principle of ought implies can. So if you are morally obligated to do something, it implies that you're actually able to do that thing that you're morally obligated to do. And the flip side is ought not imply, or cannot implies ought not. If I cannot do something, then I ought not do it, meaning I don't have an obligation to do so. And that's the basic framework that is being applied to these impossible mitzvot in the Torah by both Orthodox Judaism and the One Law movement. And I agree with that in many areas, but not here. And the reason why is because there are some times where one's own decisions incapacitate yourself so that things that used to be possible are no longer possible. So you can't just say, oh, I can't do it, therefore I'm not obligated to. Because you need to take a step back and ask, why is it impossible for me to do these things? And if I am the one responsible for the impossibility, then the obligation still stands. It's still there. So let me give you an example, okay? And then I'll bring it back to scripture. Sure. Let's say you get in a car crash because your brakes were cut. Like you were in a car crash and because you tried to press the brake in your car and the brakes didn't work. And so you crashed into that car or crashed into something. And so then you say, hey, please, insurance company, please give me the money for my losses. And then the insurance company goes and does an investigation and tries to figure out why the brakes weren't working. And then they realize that the brakes were cut on purpose. And then they interview you and you say, okay, yeah, I cut the brakes. Okay. You don't deserve those insurance payments at all because you were the one who led to the impossibility.
Sure.
Okay. So now let's apply that to why the commandments are impossible today. Everybody agrees that it's because there is no temple, there is no priesthood, there hasn't been a functioning priesthood since 70 AD, there's been no temple since 70 AD. But then let's apply this logic. Why was the temple destroyed? That changes the whole moral calculation of this conversation. Now, there have been good and bad answers given to the question of why the temple was destroyed. The bad answer has been given oftentimes by anti-Semitic Christians. It's the deicide answer. It's saying that the temple was destroyed because the Jews killed God. And therefore, the Jewish people, as a nation, as a people group, are under divine condemnation because they did an infinite sin, so they are under infinite condemnation. It's horrible. It is so evil.
Yeah.
So that is not a good biblical answer. That you can't have that answer and have Peter preach in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 3, asking fellow Jews who were there at the crucifixion to repent of their sins and to receive atonement and forgiveness.
Right.
If they're all cast out for an infinite sin, then there shouldn't be any atonement or forgiveness. So we can't go with deicide. Okay? But besides that, both Jews and Christians historically have agreed that the reason why the second temple was destroyed was because of the sins of the Jewish people in the first century. The question is, which sins? So the Orthodox position, by and large, is that it was hatred without cause. That basically there were different Jewish factions that all hated each other, especially inside Jerusalem as the Romans were attacking. They couldn't agree with each other, and because the Torah says, love your neighbor as yourself, they broke that commandment, and God judged them. So that's the Orthodox Jewish position. I think a better position, which is what Yeshua gave us in Luke chapter 19, is that all these armies will come and attack Jerusalem because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. Basically, that Jesus is God in the flesh, and that whatever God commands must be listened to. And if you choose not to listen, then there will be punishment. But then I ask the next question. Why was the destruction of the temple the punishment that God chose? Was it arbitrary? Was he just angry and he just pulled a really revengeful action out of his hat? No, it's grounded in the Torah. It is grounded in the structure of the covenant at Sinai. And I want to take us to Deuteronomy chapter 27 and Deuteronomy 28 and 29, where at the end of Deuteronomy 27, Moses has all the people of Israel say that they will keep all the Torah. And if they do not keep all the Torah, well, let me read it. So this is Deuteronomy 27:26. Cursed be anyone who does not confirm the words of this law by doing them. And all the people shall say, Amen. Okay, so if you don't do the words of the Torah, you're under a curse. Well, what does that mean? Well, you read Deuteronomy chapter 28, and it spells out the curse. And it's one of the most depressing chapters of the entire Bible. And it goes into detail what God will do to Israel if she breaks the terms of the covenant, basically rebels against God, turns her back on God. And so I encourage your listeners to go read Deuteronomy 28. And it involves the destruction of Israel's cities, the exile of the people, all over the four corners of the earth, and all kinds of horrible things. That is what happened in in AD 70. It also happened in the first temple's destruction. So, okay. The destruction of the temple in AD 70 was not arbitrary. This was God actually holding to the terms of the Torah. And it was in response to Israel having done some sin that activated the curses of the covenant. And so, if you are going to say that it doesn't matter whether we keep the impossible mitzvot, because God lets us off the hook, you're totally mistaking everything that's going on here. The impossibility of the mitzvot is due to God punishing Israel for not listening to her. Now that's a heavy message.
Yeah.
But even
You're saying that Israel cut their own brake line.
Israel cut their own brake line. And even Orthodox Jewish people admit, yes, we cut our own brake line when we hated each other, so God punished us. So everybody agrees that Israel did something bad in the first century. And the moral logic, if you follow it through, means that Jewish people are not let off the hook for doing the commandments that are obligated to them. And so along those lines, if you are going to say that you as a Gentile Christian are obligated to keep the Torah, then that means you are also obligated in Deuteronomy 27 and 28 to keep all the Torah. And if you do not keep all the Torah, then you are liable for the curses of the Torah. And we know what those are. It is exile, it is persecution, but wait, what if you say, but Jesus, Romans 8:1, has freed us from all condemnation? Well, you could say that, but that is adding to the Torah. Because nowhere in the Torah does it say that if you believe in the Messiah, that you will be released from all of these things. That is breaking the principle of not adding or removing something from the Torah, which is one of the bedrock principles of the one law movement. And so you can't get yourself out by quoting Romans 8:1.
That's a really interesting theory, and it caused me to think of something. We'll wrap up here in a minute, but I think I could talk to you for 7 hours. It made me think of something, though. As I'm trying to reason through what you're talking about, the New Testament plays a very large part in my logic and my theology, because obviously I'm a believer in it. If I'm a Jewish person who accepts the Tanakh up to where that ends, and then from there I jump over to human history and go, well, I know in AD 70 the temple was destroyed. I mean, everyone knows that, right? It's a historical fact. All of Jerusalem was destroyed. So they're trying to connect the two in their minds and thinking, like you said, that maybe there's a theory about not the hatred between brothers kind of thing. If I'm piecing things together, so let me know if I'm getting something wrong. You mentioned that most Jews admit there was a Jesus and that he tried, or he's a failed false prophet, or he was something. He was some sort of a non-Messiah figure, but he was real and he was Jewish. So do they view... let me ask it this way. I'll ask it as a question. Given all that I've just kind of laid out, how do they respond to that when you present, or have you presented, I guess, this theory to like a religious Jew and discuss the destruction of that temple?
So the response that I have received every once in a while has been, okay, I'm following the logic of what you're saying, Brian, but the heresy that happened in the first century, or the turning back against God that happened in the first century, was not Israel rejecting Jesus, but Israel, at least a remnant of Israel, accepting Jesus as the divine Son of God. That's a heresy. Jews shouldn't have done that. So God actually punished us in AD 70 with the destruction of the temple, because there were so many Jews in Jerusalem who followed Jesus.
Right.
Now, my response to that is, if that's true, then God missed his target. Because all the ancient sources of the church fathers, and you even see Jesus warning Jewish believers, they got out of Jerusalem. They fled, according to the church fathers, they fled eastward to Pella, and they escaped the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. And so that would mean that the only Jews that actually were punished in AD 70 were those Jews who stayed back, who didn't believe in Jesus. So I don't think that theory would make much sense. Why would God punish those who weren't guilty and let those off the hook who were guilty.
That's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point. Awesome. All right. Well, let's land this airplane, as they say. And I'd love to have you on again. I think we could have another few
another
conversations
7 hours.
of interest. Yeah. So before we wrap up, let me know, or let our viewers know, how can they get either a hold of you or a hold of Chosen People and maybe support what you're doing or learn more about that?
Yeah, thanks so much. So yeah, Chosen People Ministries is a mission organization that is totally dependent on individual families and individuals and congregations, churches that want to see the gospel go forth to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. You can find ways to support me if you would like to, but I would just encourage you to sign up for Chosen People Ministries newsletter in general. Give to the Chosen People Ministries General Fund. You can do that by going to chosenpeople.com. You can give in general to the work of Chosen People Ministries. You can also give to our work in Israel, which is very important right now in the context of the war. We've got around 30 staff members in Israel right now ministering in the middle of a war zone. And
Wow.
they definitely need the prayers and the financial support of followers of Jesus who want to see Jewish people blessed with the gospel. And so I would encourage you, yes, go to chosenpeople.com. You can find various ways to give. And if you feel so led, you can give to me. But I would highly encourage you to just give to the work of Chosen People Ministries in general.
Beautiful. Yeah. And I'll second that too. I've donated as well. I love the work that you're doing. And I do think it's really important in this modern day and age. So thanks for coming on, Brian. You've been a blessing. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much, Rob. Been great to be with you.
All right. Shalom.
Shalom.